Chapter 42 of Far from the Madding Crowd. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tig Hines. Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. Chapter 42. Joseph and his burden. Buck's Head. A wall bounded the site of Casterbridge Union House, except along a portion of the end. Here a high gable stood prominent, and it was covered, like the front, with a mat of ivy. In this gable was no window, chimney, ornament, or protuberance of any kind. The single feature appertaining to it, beyond the expanse of dark green leaves, was a small door. The situation of the door was peculiar. The sill was 3 or 4 feet above the ground, and for a moment one was at a loss for an explanation of this exceptional altitude, till ruts immediately beneath suggested that the door was used solely for the passage of articles and persons to and from the level of a vehicle standing on the outside. Upon the whole, the door seemed to advertise itself as a species of Traitor's Gate translated to another sphere. That entry and exit hereby was only at rare intervals became apparent on noting that tufts of grass were allowed to flourish undisturbed in the chinks of the sill. As the clock over the South Street almshouse pointed to 5 minutes to 3, a blue spring waggon, picked out with red and containing boughs of flowers, passed the end of the street, and up towards this side of the building. Whilst the chimes were yet stammering out a shattered form of Malbrook, Joseph Poorgrass rang the bell, and received directions to back his waggon against the high door under the gable. The door then opened, and a plain elm coffin was slowly thrust forth, and laid by 2 men in fustian along the middle of the vehicle. One of the men then stepped up beside it, took from his pocket a lump of chalk, and wrote upon the cover the name and a few other words in a large scrawling hand. We believe that they do these things more tenderly now, and provide a plate. He covered the whole with a black cloth, threadbare but decent. The tailboard of the waggon was returned to its place. One of the men handed a certificate of registry to Poorgrass, and both entered the door, closing it behind them. Their connection with her, short as it had been, was over for ever. Joseph then placed the flowers as enjoined, and the evergreens around the flowers, till it was difficult to divine what the waggon contained. He smacked his whip, and the rather pleasing funeral car crept down the hill, and along the road to Weatherbury. The afternoon drew on apace, and looking to the right towards the sea as he walked beside the horse, Poorgrass saw strange clouds and scrolls of mist rolling over the long ridges which girt the landscape in that quarter. They came in yet greater volumes, and indolently crept across the intervening valleys, and around the withered papery flags of the moor and river brinks. Then their dank spongy forms closed in upon the sky. It was a sudden overgrowth of atmospheric fungi which had their roots in the neighbouring sea, and by the time that horse, man, and corpse entered Yalbury Great Wood, these silent workings of an invisible hand had reached them, and they were completely enveloped, this being the first arrival of the autumn fogs, and the first fog of the series. The air was as an eye suddenly struck blind. The waggon and its load rolled no longer on the horizontal division between clearness and opacity, but were embedded in an elastic body of a monotonous pallor throughout. There was no perceptible motion in the air. Not a visible drop of water fell upon a leaf in the beeches, birches, and firs composing the wood on either side. The trees stood in an attitude of intentness, as if they waited longingly for a wind to come and rock them. A startling quiet overhung all surrounding things, so completely that the crunching of the waggon wheels was as a great noise, and small rustles, which had never obtained a hearing except by night, were distinctly individualized. Joseph Poorgrass looked round upon his sad burden as it loomed faintly through the flowering laurestines, then at the unfathomable gloom amid the high trees on each hand, indistinct, shadowless, and spectre-like in their monochrome of grey. He felt anything but cheerful, and wished he had the company of even a child or dog. Stopping the horse, he listened. Not a footstep or wheel was audible anywhere around, and the dead silence was broken only by a heavy particle falling from a tree through the evergreens and alighting with a smart rap upon the coffin of poor Fanny. The fog had by this time saturated the trees, and this was the first dropping of water from the overbrimming leaves. The hollow echo of its fall reminded the waggoner painfully of the grim leveller. Then hard by came down another drop, then two or three. Presently there was a continual tapping of these heavy drops upon the dead leaves, the road, and the travellers. The nearer boughs were beaded with the mist to the greyness of aged men, and the rusty red leaves of the beeches were hung with similar drops, like diamonds on auburn hair. At the roadside hamlet called Roytown, just beyond this wood, was the old inn Buck's Head. It was about a mile and a half from Weatherbury, and in the meridian times of stage-coach travelling had been the place where many coaches changed and kept their relays of horses. All the old stabling was now pulled down, and little remained besides the habitable inn itself, which, standing a little way back from the road, signified its existence to people far up and down the highway by a sign hanging from the horizontal bough of an elm on the opposite side of the way. Travellers, for the variety tourists had hardly developed into a distinct species at this state, sometimes said in passing, when they cast their eyes up to the sign-bearing tree, that artists were fond of representing the signboard hanging thus, but that they themselves had never before noticed so perfect an instance in actual working order. It was near this tree that the waggon was standing into which Gabriel Oak crept on his first journey to Weatherbury, but owing to the darkness the sign and the inn had been unobserved. The manners of the inn were of the old established type. Indeed, in the minds of its frequenters they existed as unalterable formulae. Example: rap with the bottom of your pint for more liquor. For tobacco, shout. In calling for the girl in waiting, say maid. Ditto for the landlady, old soul, etc., etc. It was a relief to Joseph's heart when the friendly signboard came in view, and stopping his horse immediately beneath it, he proceeded to fulfil an intention made a long time before. His spirits were oozing out of him quite. He turned the horse's head to the green bank, and entered the hostel for a mug of ale. Going down into the kitchen of the inn, the floor of which was a step below the passage, which in its turn was a step below the road outside, what should Joseph see to gladden his eyes but two copper-coloured discs, in the form of the countenances of Mr. Jan Coggan and Mr. Mark Clark. These owners of the two most appreciative throats in the neighbourhood, within the pale of respectability, were now sitting face to face over a three-legged circular table, having an iron rim to keep the cups and pots from being accidentally elbowed off. They might have been said to resemble the setting sun and the full moon shining vis-à-vis across the globe. "Why, 'tis neighbour Poorgrass," said Mark Clark. "I'm sure your face don't praise your mistress's table, Joseph." "I had a very pale companion for the last 4 miles," said Joseph, indulging in a shudder toned down by resignation. "And to speak the truth, 'twas beginning to tell upon me. I assure you I hadn't seen the colour of victuals or drink since breakfast time this morning, and that was no more than a dew bit afield." "Then drink, Joseph, and don't restrain yourself," said Coggan, handing him a hooped mug 3/4 full. Joseph drank for a moderately long time, then for a longer time, saying as he lowered the jug, "'Tis pretty drinking, very pretty drinking, and is more than cheerful on my melancholy errand, so to speak it." "True, drink is a pleasant delight," said Jan, as one who repeated a truism so familiar to his brain that he hardly noticed its passage over his tongue. And lifting the cup, Coggan tilted his head gradually backwards, with eyes closed, that his expectant soul might not be diverted for one instant from its bliss by irrelevant surroundings. "Well, I must be on again," said Poorgrass. "Not but that I should like another nip with ye, but the parish might lose confidence in me if I was seed here." Where you be trading off to today, then, Joseph? Back to Weatherbury. I got poor little Fanny Robin in my waggon outside, and I must be at the churchyard gates at 4:45 with her. Ah, I've heard of it. And so she's nailed up in parish boards after all, and nobody to pay the bell shilling and the grave half-crown. The parish pays the grave half-crown, but not the bell shilling, because the bell's a luxury. But I can't hardly do without the grave, poor body. However, I expect our mistress will pay all. A pretty maid as ever I see. But what's your hurry, Joseph? The poor woman's dead, and you can't bring her back to life, and you may as well sit down comfortable and finish another with us. I don't mind taking just the least thimbleful you can dream of more with ye, sonnies, but only a few minutes, 'cause 'tis as it is. Of course you'll have another drop. A man's twice the man afterwards. You feel so warm and glorious, and you whop and slap at your work without any trouble, and everything goes on like sticks a-breaking. Too much liquor is bad, and leads us to that horned man in the smoky house. But after all, many people haven't the gift of enjoying a wet, and since we be highly favoured with a power that way, we should make the most of it. True, said Mark Clark. 'Tis a talent the Lord has mercifully bestowed upon us, and we ought not to neglect it. But what with the parsons and the clerks and school people and serious tea parties, the merry old ways of good life have gone to the dogs. Upon my carcass they have. Well, really, I must be onward again now, said Joseph. Now, Joseph, nonsense. The poor woman is dead, isn't she? And what's your hurry? Well, I hope Providence won't be in a way with me for my doings, said Joseph, sitting down again. I've been troubled with weak moments lately, 'tis true. I've been drinky once this month already, and I did not go to church a Sunday, and I dropped a curse or two yesterday, so I don't want to go too far from my safety. Your next world is your next world, and not to be squandered off-hand. I believe you to be a chapel member, Joseph, that I do. Oh, no, I don't go so far as that. For my part, said Coggan, I'm staunch Church of England. Ay, and faith so be I, said Mark Clark. I won't say much for myself, I don't wish to, Coggan continued, with that tendency to talk on principles which is characteristic of the barleycorn. But I've never changed a single doctrine. I've stuck like a plaster to the old faith I was born in. Yes, there's this to be said for the church. A man can belong to the church and bide in his cheerful old inn, and never trouble or worry his mind about doctrines at all. But to be a meetinger, you must go to chapel in all winds and weathers, and make yourself as frantic as a skit. Not but that chapel members be clever chaps enough in their way. They can lift up beautiful prayers out of their own heads, all about their families and shipwrecks in the newspaper. They can, said Mark Clark with corroborative feeling. But we churchmen, you see, must have it all printed aforehand, or dang it all, we should no more know what to say to a great gaffer like the Lord than babes unborn. Chapel folk be more hand and glove with them above than we, said Joseph thoughtfully. Yes, said Coggan. We know very well that if anybody do go to heaven, they will. They've worked hard for it, and they deserve to have it, such as 'tis. I bain't such a fool as to pretend that we who stick to the church have the same chance as they, because we know we have not. But I hate a feller who'll change his old ancient doctrines for the sake of getting to heaven. I'd as soon turn king's evidence for the few pounds you get. Why, neighbours, when every one of my taties were frosted, our Parson Thirdly were the man who gave me a sack for seed, though he hardly had one for his own use, and no money to buy him. If it hadn't been for him, I shouldn't have had a tatie to put in my garden. Do you think I'd turn after that? No, I'll stick to my side, and if we be in the wrong, so be it. I'll fall with the fallen. Well said, very well said, observed Joseph. However, folks, I must be moving on now. Upon my life I must. Parson Thirdly be waiting at the church gates, and there's the woman abiding outside in the waggon. Joseph Poorgrass, don't be so miserable. Parson Thirdly won't mind. He's a generous man. He's found me in tracts for years, and I've consumed a good many in the course of a long and shady life, but he's never been the man to cry out at the expense. Sit down." The longer Joseph Poorgrass remained, the less his spirit was troubled by the duties which devolved upon him this afternoon. The minutes glided by uncounted, until the evening shades began perceptibly to deepen, and the eyes of the three were but sparkling points on the surface of darkness. Coggan's repeater struck 6 from his pocket in the usual still small tones. At that moment hasty steps were heard in the entry, and the door opened to admit the figure of Gabriel Oak, followed by the maid of the inn bearing a candle. He stared sternly at the one lengthy and 2 round faces of the sitters, which confronted him with the expressions of a fiddle and a couple of warming pans. Joseph Poorgrass blinked, and shrank several inches into the background. "Upon my soul, I'm ashamed of you. 'Tis disgraceful, Joseph, disgraceful," said Gabriel indignantly. "Coggan, call yourself a man, and don't know better than this?" Coggan looked up indefinitely at Oak, one or other of his eyes occasionally opening and closing of its own accord, as if it were not a member, but a dozy individual with a distinct personality. "Don't take on so, shepherd," said Mark Clark, looking reproachfully at the candle, which appeared to possess special features of interest for his eyes. "Nobody can hurt a dead woman," at length said Coggan, with the precision of a machine. "All that could be done for her is done. She's beyond us, and why should a man put himself in a tearing hurry for lifeless clay that can neither feel nor see, and don't know what you do with her at all? If she'd been alive, I would have been the first to help her. If she now wanted victuals and drinks, I'd pay for it, money down. But she's dead, and no speed of ours will bring her to life. The woman's past us, time spent upon her is throwed away. Why should we hurry to do what's not required? Drink, shepherd, and be friends, for tomorrow we may be like her." "We may," added Mark Clark emphatically, at once drinking himself, to run no further risk of losing his chance by the event alluded to, Jan meanwhile merging his additional thoughts of tomorrow in a song. "Tomorrow, tomorrow, and while peace and plenty I find at my board, with a heart free from sickness and sorrow, with my friends I will share what today may afford, and let them spread the table tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow." "Do hold thy horning, Jan," said Oak, and turning upon Poorgrass, "as for you, Joseph, who do your wicked deeds in such confoundedly holy ways, you are as drunk as you can stand." "No, Shepherd Oak, no. Listen to reason, shepherd. All that's the matter with me is the affliction called a multiplying eye, and that's how it is I look double to you. I mean, you look double to me." "A multiplying eye is a very bad thing," said Mark Clark. "It always comes on when I've been in a public house a little time," said Joseph Poorgrass meekly. "Yes, I see two of every sort, as if I were some holy man living in the times of King Noah and entering into the ark. Yes," he added, becoming much affected by the picture of himself as a person thrown away, and shedding tears, "I feel too good for England. I ought to have lived in Genesis by right, like the other men of sacrifice, and then I shouldn't have been called a drunkard in such a way." "I wish you'd show yourself a man of spirit, and not sit whining there." "Show myself a man of spirit? Ah, well, let me take the name of drunkard humbly, and let me be a man of contrite knees, let it be. I know that I do always say, 'Please God,' afore I do anything, from my getting up to my going down of the same, and I'd be willing to take as much disgrace as there is in that holy act. Ah, yes, but not a man of spirit. Have I ever allowed the toe of pride to be lifted against my hinder parts without groaning manfully that I question the right to do so? I inquire that query boldly." "We can't say that you have, hero Poorgrass," admitted Jan. "Never have I allowed such treatment to pass unquestioned, yet the shepherd says in the face of that rich testimony that I be not a man of spirit. Well, let it pass by, and death is a kind friend." Gabriel, seeing that neither of the three was in a fit state to take charge of the waggon for the remainder of the journey, made no reply, but, closing the door again upon them, went across to where the vehicle stood, now getting indistinct in the fog and gloom of this mildewy time. He pulled the horse's head from the large patch of turf it had eaten bare, readjusted the boughs over the coffin, and drove along through the unwholesome night. It had gradually become rumoured in the village that the body to be brought and buried that day was all that was left of the unfortunate Fanny Robin, who had followed the 11th from Casterbridge through Melchester and onwards. But, thanks to Boldwood's reticence and Oak's generosity, the lover she had followed had never been individualized as Troy. Gabriel hoped that the whole truth of the matter might not be published till at any rate the girl had been in her grave for a few days, when the interposing barriers of earth and time, and a sense that the events had been somewhat shut into oblivion, would deaden the sting that revelation and invidious remark would have for Bathsheba just now. By the time that Gabriel reached the old manor house, her residence, which lay in his way to the church, it was quite dark. A man came from the gate and said through the fog, which hung between them like blown flour, "Is that Poorgrass with the corpse?" Gabriel recognized the voice as that of the parson. "The corpse is here, sir," said Gabriel. "I have just been to inquire of Mrs. Troy if she could tell me the reason for the delay. I am afraid it is too late now for the funeral to be performed with proper decency. Have you the registrar's certificate?" "No," said Gabriel. "I expect Poorgrass has that, and he's at the Buck's Head. I forgot to ask him for it." "Then that settles the matter. We'll put off the funeral till tomorrow morning. The body may be brought on to the church, or it may be left here at the farm, and fetched by the bearers in the morning. They waited more than an hour, and have now gone home." Gabriel had his reasons for thinking the latter a most objectionable plan, notwithstanding that Fanny had been an inmate of the farmhouse for several years in the lifetime of Bathsheba's uncle. Visions of several unhappy contingencies which might arise from this delay flitted before him. But his will was not law, and he went indoors to inquire of his mistress what were her wishes on the subject. He found her in an unusual mood. Her eyes, as she looked up to him, were suspicious and perplexed, as with some antecedent thought. Troy had not yet returned. At first Bathsheba assented with a mien of indifference to his proposition that they should go on to the church at once with their burden, but immediately afterwards, following Gabriel to the gate, she swerved to the extreme of solicitousness on Fanny's account, and desired that the girl might be brought into the house. Oak argued upon the convenience of leaving her in the waggon, just as she lay now, with her flowers and green leaves about her, merely wheeling the vehicle into the coach-house till the morning, but to no purpose. "It is unkind and unchristian," she said, "to leave the poor thing in the coach-house all night." "Very well, then," said the parson, "and I will arrange that the funeral shall take place early tomorrow. Perhaps Mrs. Troy is right in feeling that we cannot treat a dead fellow creature too thoughtfully. We must remember that though she may have erred grievously in leaving her home, she is still our sister, and it is to be believed that God's uncovenanted mercies are extended towards her, and that she is a member of the flock of Christ." The parson's words spread into the heavy air with a sad yet unperturbed cadence, and Gabriel shed an honest tear. Bathsheba seemed unmoved. Mr. Thirdly then left them, and Gabriel lighted a lantern. Fetching 3 other men to assist him, they bore the unconscious truant indoors, placing the coffin on 2 benches in the middle of the little sitting-room next the hall, as Bathsheba directed. Everyone except Gabriel Oak then left the room. He still indecisively lingered beside the body. He was deeply troubled at the wretchedly ironical aspect that circumstances were putting on with regard to Troy's wife, and at his own powerlessness to counteract them. In spite of his careful manoeuvring all this day, the very worst event that could in any way have happened in connection with the burial had happened now. Oak imagined the terrible discovery resulting from this afternoon's work that might cast over Bathsheba's life a shade which the interposition of many lapsing years might but indifferently lighten, and which nothing at all might altogether remove. Suddenly, as in a last attempt to save Bathsheba from, at any rate, immediate anguish, he looked again, as he had looked before, at the chalk writing upon the coffin lid. The scrawl was this simple one: Fanny Robin and child. Gabriel took his handkerchief and carefully rubbed out the two latter words, leaving visible the inscription Fanny Robin only. He then left the room and went out quietly by the front door. End of chapter 42.